In the Middle Ages, a couple had almost no chance of getting to know each other. So, how did people still fall in love? Welcome to this quiet but surprising story. Welcome back to the Sleep Chronicles channel. In this video, we'll show you a world very different from ours. There was no flirting, no romantic dates, and love was often like a game planned by families. However, people seized small opportunities to get to know each other, using fairs, after-church gatherings, and harvest times as excuses to meet. Some couples understood each other at first sight, while others watched each other for years, under family supervision. And the most interesting part, despite all these difficulties, love and passion often blossomed in unexpected places. Now we'll take you into the unknown details of the medieval dating world, where you'll be both surprised and amused at every turn. The silent beginnings of love. In the Middle Ages, invisible rules. In medieval Europe, love was not a free emotion in the sense we understand it today. Instead of openly expressing their feelings, people showed them through silent signals and carefully chosen behaviors. This was because, in all segments of society, marriage and relationships were not merely between two individuals, but part of a system established between families, guilds, and even village communities. When a young woman or man expressed interest in someone, they wouldn't say it aloud. Instead, glances would linger, seemingly coincidental encounters would increase. They would repeatedly walk down the same street and linger in front of the same stall in the market. While these behaviors might seem accidental, they were often deliberate. The safest way to gauge someone's interest was to observe their reactions from a distance. Did the other person avert their gaze? Or did they smile even for a moment? Did they try to stay close in a crowd? Or did they hide behind their family? Each of these was a signal that replaced unspoken words. But this silent language was also open to misinterpretation, and misunderstandings could sometimes lead to gossip, sometimes to family intervention, and sometimes to unexpected arguments. In villages and small towns where everyone knew each other, this process was even more delicate. A glance that lasted too long, a smile directed at the wrong person, could quickly become the talk of the town. Therefore, people were cautious, only sharing their feelings with a few trusted individuals. Often a family member, a close friend, sibling, or aunt would act as an intermediary. These individuals would weigh the intentions of both parties, assess the potential reactions of the families, and wait for the right moment. In cities, the situation was somewhat different. Thanks to the crowds, young people could observe each other more easily and have short conversations at fairs or after church services. However, there were rules here too. Talking alone for a long time was frowned upon. A third person was always expected to be nearby. This protected the young people's reputations and prevented gossip. In this world, love was not a word spoken aloud, but a process patiently woven together. People didn't rush to express their feelings. They first tried to understand the other person's intentions, because a wrong move could put not only the two individuals, but also both families in a difficult situation. Fairs and quiet opportunities. Fairs, held at certain times of the year, were not just places for shopping for people in the Middle Ages. They were also one of the rare social settings where young people could see each other, observe each other from afar, and have brief encounters. Colorful fabrics, the scent of spices, the slow melodies of musicians, and the hum of the crowd provided a natural backdrop for these encounters. A young girl, while browsing the stalls with her mother, might notice a young man wandering in the same direction. The young man would move to another stall after a while, but would reappear in the same place a few minutes later. This might seem like a coincidence, but it was often planned. Choosing the same path in the crowd was a safe excuse to come together. Conversations were kept short. A few words about the weather, a simple question about the goods being sold, a casual sentence about how the journey went. What mattered more than what was said was the tone. Was the voice soft? Were the eyes on the ground? Or was there a brief smile accompanying the other person? These small details gave clues to future possibilities. Fairs were also places where families observed. Parents carefully watched who their children talked to, who they stood next to, and who they distanced themselves from. If one family was interested in another, they might direct their children in that direction, facilitating encounters under the pretext of a shared purchase. However, not everything was so controlled. Some young people would manage to be alone for a brief moment behind the crowd, sharing a few whispers. These whispers often consisted of simple information such as names, ages, or which village they came from. But even this small piece of information could carry great meaning, because it was a silent sign that two people were beginning to get to know each other. When everyone returned home at the end of the fair, not only the goods bought remained in their minds, but also the faces they encountered, the voices they heard, and the eye contact they made. For some, these moments were quickly forgotten, while for others they became memories that lingered for a long time. The shadow of families. In the Middle Ages, relationships were always overshadowed by families. Even if a young person was interested in someone, that interest often had to pass through the filter of their family first, because marriage was seen not only as an emotional bond, but also as an economic and social agreement. Lands, shops, professions, and reputation were the fundamental elements behind these decisions. When a family noticed that their child had met a suitable person, they would first investigate the other person's background. Which family did they come from? How did they make a living? Did they have debts? Did they have a bad reputation? This information was gathered through neighbors, church records, or guild members. Often, this process was carried out secretly, even from the young people themselves. Parents did not directly ask their children about their feelings. Instead, they would ask indirect questions, bring up specific names, and gauge reactions. Did their facial expression change when a name was mentioned? Did they want to quickly end the conversation, or did they prolong it? These small reactions gave families important clues. In some cases, families would openly intervene, using relatives or neighbors as intermediaries to bring the two sides together. These mediators would weigh the expectations of both families, discuss the terms, and explore whether there was a basis for a possible agreement. For young people, this process was sometimes hopeful, sometimes overwhelming, because their feelings didn't always align with their family's plans. Yet, most knew they lived in a world where openly opposing things was difficult. To object could mean going against not only their parents but the entire community. Therefore, many young people kept their feelings to themselves, silently observing their family's guidance. Others tried to make their preferences known through small gestures, indirect words, or through a trusted relative. The church and the social framework. In medieval society, the church strictly controlled not only religious life but also marriage and relationships. Who could marry whom, degrees of kinship, engagement processes, and wedding ceremonies were shaped within the framework of church rules. Therefore, even if a relationship received the approval of the families, it could not go beyond the boundaries set by the church. Sunday services were one of the most orderly environments where young people could see each other. However, even here, behavior was carefully controlled. Long stares were not welcomed, and whispers were immediately noticed. Nevertheless, people could not help but glance at the other person for a brief moment in the crowd. Church records examined the backgrounds of couples applying for marriage. Kinship ties were investigated, and previous engagements or promises were questioned. This process could sometimes last for months, during which time couples had to wait patiently. Religious teachings emphasized that love should be moderate and advised that passion should be kept under control. This caused young people to live their feelings even more secretly. Instead of openly expressing affection, interest was shown through small gifts, offers of help, or short letters. Thus, in the Middle Ages, flirting was less a free process in the modern sense, and more a long journey surrounded by rules, expectations, and observations. This journey was experienced as a patient, quietly progressing experience, often dependent on the decisions of others. Moments when gazes speak. In medieval cities, love often didn't begin with words. In a marketplace, at a fountain, or in a churchyard, two people's gazes would meet for a brief moment, then immediately turn away, because even prolonged eye contact could be misunderstood. Women walked with their heads slightly bowed, and men pretended to lower their gaze. But at that very moment, a tiny glance gliding between their eyelids sometimes conveyed more than a long conversation. Young people didn't call out to each other directly. A hand gesture, the dropping of a handkerchief, the adjustment of hair, or the turning away immediately after a smile was considered a hidden message. Societal rules were strict. It was frowned upon for a single man and woman to be alone together, therefore love was experienced in crowds. Finding one another in a crowd walking outside a church, buying bread from the same bakery, filling with water from the same fountain. Each one was a small but meaningful encounter, and people knew this. If a glance was noticed, there was no turning back. Letters, songs, and secret signs. In the Middle Ages, love was often hidden within a few lines written on paper, but these lines were not like today's open confessions. No one would write, "I love you," because such a sentence, if it fell into the wrong hands, could put not only two hearts but an entire family in jeopardy. Therefore, letters were woven with secrets. When a young man wrote to his beloved, "The fig tree in the garden has borne fruit," he might actually be implying that a meeting could take place. The sentence, "The wind is blowing from the east," could imply that he was alone at home. And "the nights have grown longer" would be a silent sign that his patience was running out. Letters were sometimes hidden inside bread baskets. Sometimes they were tucked between church pews, and sometimes they were placed in a child's pocket and sent from one door to another without the child knowing what they were carrying. But there was always a risk: a mother finding the letter, a neighbor becoming suspicious, a priest accidentally noticing the paper. That's why some lovers would give up writing. Instead, they would rely on songs. The verses sung by wandering minstrels as they traveled from town to town were sometimes more than just entertainment. A word within a melody would reach a person's heart. The place where a line stopped would be completed by a glance. A young man would pretend to listen to an ordinary love song sung in the middle of a crowd, and at that very moment he would look at the woman he loved. The woman, meanwhile, would seem to listen to the song with her head bowed, but her fingers would tightly grasp the edge of her skirt. Sometimes music wasn't enough. A stone would be thrown at the window, light too small to be heard. A candle would be extinguished in the room, then it would be lit again. This was a way of saying, "I am here." But I am here, that wasn't said aloud, and everyone knew. If the signs increased, it meant the feelings had grown too strong to hide any longer. Places of secret meetings. If love was secret, then the places had to be secret too. Narrow streets in the shadow of city walls, abandoned chapels, paths between vineyards, bridgeheads almost invisible when the fog descended. Meetings were short. Long conversations were risky. Sometimes only a few sentences were exchanged. Sometimes hands touched for a second and then immediately separated. A woman would always be accompanied by a relative or servant, but this companion often walked a few steps behind, consciously looking in another direction. Because love wasn't always forbidden, but it was controlled. When the city gates closed at night, people whispered from windows. Small stones thrown from opposite buildings were a secret signal. If a window opened, there was hope. If it didn't open, one had to wait. And waiting was what medieval lovers knew best. The shadow of family and fear. But in the Middle Ages, love was never just a matter between two people. Behind every meeting, every glance, every whisper, an unseen shadow lurked. Family. Marriages were often shaped at bargaining tables. Emotions were not invited to these tables. Land spoke, gold spoke, surnames spoke. A young girl might learn that she is to marry a man she has never known since childhood. And on the night she learns this, she might sit for a long time in front of her window. She would listen to the footsteps passing in the street, perhaps trying to distinguish the steps of the person she loved. A young man, upon hearing his family's plans, would try to show nothing on his face, but he couldn't sleep at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to silence the thoughts running through his mind. Some families were stricter. Letters were burned. Servants were given instructions. Windows were closed earlier. Sometimes a young girl was noticed talking to someone else. Even if it was only thought that they were talking, gossip would start. And gossip spread faster than fire in the Middle Ages. They saw her in the market. Her mother wasn't with her. They whispered for a long time. These whispers, whether true or not, could change destinies. Some lovers were forced to separate. Some were sent to other cities. Some were married off hastily. And some stories were never completed. Even years later, people would whisper, they once loved each other. But in the Middle Ages, The heaviest sentence was, "It's too late now." And in the next part, we come to the point where things get even more dangerous. Because the secret love is about to become something everyone is talking about. The time of secret encounters night steps. When the city fell asleep, the medieval streets took on a completely different character. The stone streets, bustling with noise during the day, were filled only with the sound of leaves rustling in the wind at night. Windows closed, doors locked, and lantern lights went out one by one. But for some people, night was not the beginning of sleep, but of courage. A young man would enter a narrow alley, raising the collar of his cloak. He would slow his steps, trying not to echo on the stones. He would stop at every corner, listen carefully, and then walk on again. Even the barking of a dog could make his heart race. He carried a small lantern, but only lit it when walking close to walls. Lighting it in the open was like shouting, "I'm here." He would walk past a church with his head down, trying not to look at the dark silhouette of the bell tower, because that tower was not only a place of prayer, but also a symbol of watchful eyes. A little further on, it stood beside a stone fountain. That spot was predetermined. If a candle was burning on the fountain, it meant the other side had arrived. If it was dark, they had to wait. If there was no one there, perhaps the meeting had been cancelled that night. Waiting was the hardest test of patience for medieval lovers. As the minutes passed, their hearts beat faster, every footstep sounding like a threat. But just as hope began to fade, a silhouette would emerge from the shadows, slightly raising its head, and at that moment, all fears would be silenced for a moment. Whispers in the church garden. Church gardens seemed peaceful during the day. Flowers bloomed, priests prayed, and people lit candles. But when night fell, the same garden took on a different meaning. High stone walls blocked the wind, trees cast dark shadows, and gravestones became pale shapes in the moonlight. It wasn't a frightening place, but its silence was heavy. The young woman lifted her skirt slightly as she entered through the door. The damp smell of the earth reached her nose, and her shoes were wet with dew. The person waiting for her stood under an old cypress tree. They approached each other without speaking, communicating only with their eyes, then bowing their heads towards one another. Their voices were low, for the stone walls carried the whispers. No one saw, did they? One would ask. The other would simply nod. Sometimes they didn't even speak. They walked side by side, listening to the rustling of the leaves in the trees. Their fingers would come so close they almost touched, but most of the time they wouldn't. Even touching required courage. Taking one more step could upset the whole balance. A few minutes spent in the churchyard sometimes felt like weeks of waiting. And when they parted, the same fear was always there. Will we be able to see each other again next time? Shadow plays in the courtyards. The inner courtyards of the large stone houses were bustling with life during the day. Servants drew water from the wells, carried baskets, children ran around, and doors opened and closed incessantly. But when night fell, all this movement seemed to be drawn into the stones. The courtyards fell silent. Only the rustling of leaves carried by the wind could be heard. This silence was both inviting and dangerous for secret meetings. The young man would walk, leaning against the thick stone walls. He would watch the moonlight fall on the ground, observing his own shadow lengthen and shorten on the wall. One extra step could slip his shadow into a doorway, and sometimes the shadow was noticed before the person. He carefully placed his feet on the ground, trying not to echo on the stone floor. If the pebbles were loose, he would change direction, avoiding stepping over dry leaves. The fountain in the middle of the courtyard dripped water. That sound was unexpectedly loud in the darkness. The woman stood under an arched passageway. Her hand clutched the hem of her cloak tightly, because waiting was harder than walking. "You're late," she would say, almost whispering. "There was someone at the door," he would reply. Even a few words were risky. They would be silent for a moment, looking together at the sky that covered the courtyard. The clouds moved slowly, the moonlight leaving silvery patches on the stone floor. In that light, their faces were a little clearer. They would take a step closer, then stop. Their fingers would come together, then pull back, because everything here had to be measured, even laughter. If a sound rose, it could bounce off the walls and reach other places. The young man surveyed the surroundings, looking at the balconies, the upper floor windows. The woman, at the same time, counted the closed doors. How many exits were there? Where could they escape to? If someone suddenly appears? That's exactly how love was experienced in the Middle Ages, calculated precisely. Fear of being caught. Every secret meeting ended with a heavy weight on their hearts. Fear, not just the thought of someone seeing them, the thought of it becoming a story, someone telling it to someone else, the story growing, walking from street to street. The young woman would change her route twice on her way home. Instead of entering the street she normally used, she would choose the back passages, because passing through the same route frequently would attract attention. As she approached the door, she would adjust the hem of her cloak, gather her hair, and slow her breathing, because haste was the quickest way to give someone away. The young man made similar calculations. He would lower his hat a little more, leaving his face in shadow. He would look at the light seeping through each window, trying to figure out if someone was inside. When a dog barked, he would stop and listen to the direction of the sound. When a door creaked, his heart would quicken. When a night watchman appeared, he would change his gait, acting as if he had another task to do. That was the most dangerous thing, appearing natural. They walked as if they didn't know each other. They passed side by side, without looking, without speaking, but their hearts beat in the same rhythm, because they knew one day someone would really stop. One day someone would ask a question, and when that moment came, escaping wouldn't always be possible. Perhaps the gossip would have already started. Perhaps someone behind a window had already memorized what they saw in the moonlight, and that possibility, that was what kept them awake the most at night. The whispers begin. At first, no one spoke loudly, but the atmosphere in the city had begun to change slowly. In the mornings, the area around the neighborhood fountain was more crowded than before. The sound of water filling the bucket mingled with conversations. Women would stop before finishing their sentences and glance around, turning their heads slightly. When a stranger approached, voices would be lowered and eyes would fall to the ground. Those waiting for bread in front of the bakery would look behind those in line, checking to see if the curtain in the window of the house opposite had moved. The light burning in the evenings on the upper floor of a door had become more noticeable. "I saw someone late last night," someone would say. "Who was it?" "I don't know, but he wasn't alone." Sentences would be left unfinished because mentioning names meant formalizing the gossip, and no one wanted to be the first. The young man noticed that people's stares lingered a little longer than before as he walked down the street during the day. The young woman encountered the same faces several times while shopping at the market, and she sensed it was no coincidence. The doors closed a little earlier in the evenings. The windows were drawn earlier. The city had begun to listen silently. The family's suspicion. The atmosphere inside the houses had changed. Evening meals weren't as relaxed as before. The sound of spoons clinking in soup bowls grew longer, and no one wanted to be the first to speak. "You stayed at the market a long time today," a father would say, his voice calm but his gaze watchful. The young woman would answer without lifting her head. It was crowded. "Who was with you?" "The neighbor's daughter." Her mother would watch her silently, the dust on the edge of her cloak, the mud on her shoes, the slight dishevelment in her hair. None of these were meaningful on their own, but when they came together, the questions multiplied. The young man also walked slower each time he returned home. He would look at his father's face as he entered the door, then immediately turn his head away. His mother would push the plate she placed on the table a little too carefully. The servants would eavesdrop. The doorman would look as if taking note of those who arrived late. No one said anything openly, but the silence inside the houses was no longer peaceful. The watchers, walking the streets, they felt they were no longer alone. Night watchmen were more frequently seen. The lanterns shone brighter than before, leaving long streaks of light on the stone walls. The number of officials patrolling the churchyards had increased. Some seemed to be praying, others stood and gazed intently around. Someone might slightly part the curtain behind a window. A shadow might stir at the edge of a roof. A brief face might appear in the gap of a door. It had become difficult to distinguish which was real and which was a trick of fear. The young woman would stop at every corner to see if someone was following her, then continue walking. The young man mistook his own shadow reflected on the walls for the silhouette of another. Fear sharpened not the eyes but the imagination, and the city was slowly transforming into a city of the watchers. Meetings becoming more difficult, meetings no longer went as planned. If a signal was missing, no one would show up. If a window was closed, the night was considered over. The waiting time at the fountain lengthened. Even walking side by side had become risky. Touching was almost forbidden. But every second was more precious than ever before. A glance, a nod, a whisper. These would turn into memories cherished for weeks. No one looked back when parting, because looking could leave a trace. Everyone felt this. This city was no longer theirs. The city had become a web woven by gossip and suspicion, and that web was tightening. The moment the silence broke, the city no longer breathed as it used to. Even though the streets looked the same, people's gazes had changed. It felt as if someone was listening behind every door. A shadow lingered long in every window, and the echo of whispers continued in every corner. When the young man went to the market in the morning, he noticed that his shoulders were a little more tense as he walked among the stalls. People he used to greet now took longer to look up and averted their gaze more quickly. When he stopped in front of a fish stall, He saw the seller interrupt himself and look across the street. These small movements, individually, might seem meaningless, but when combined, they painted a heavy picture. When the young woman looked out of her window, she felt that the street was emptier than before. Doors were closed, curtains were drawn early, and even if a few people were talking, they were lowering their voices. When her mother came up behind her and slowly closed the window, she said nothing, but that gesture spoke louder than anything else. That day, their paths crossed outside the church. They walked through the crowd, trying not to look at each other, but just as they passed side by side, their eyes met for a moment. There was haste in that look, and a question. Do they know? They understood each other without speaking. As evening approached, waiting for news became more difficult. If no sign came, there would be no meeting. If no candle was lit, if no door was ajar, if no window was opened, the night would pass alone. And that night, the sign was delayed. The young man stood in the narrow street and looked into the darkness. He didn't light his lantern because the light would attract attention. The wind rustled the edge of his cloak, and the sound of his heart echoed in his ears. The minutes stretched on. Finally, a shadow appeared, but not from where he expected. Another door opened. 2 silhouettes emerged from inside. They were talking, and the direction they were looking, it was his. The young man recoiled, leaned against the wall, and held his breath. They walked down the street. They seemed to be searching for something. Perhaps someone. Perhaps her. At that moment, for the first time, the thought struck him, this wasn't just gossip. Someone was really watching. A little later, from a great distance, the signal he was waiting for lit up. But that light was no longer reassuring, because until that moment, it was clear that other eyes were also open in the night. And when the young woman looked out her window at the street, the reason her heart raced wasn't just waiting. She felt something was getting very close. She couldn't yet put a name to it, but it was getting closer, and this time turning back would be difficult. First open questions. The next morning, the city awoke to a strange silence. There were fewer people on the streets than usual, the shops opened late, and the church bells rang a little longer than usual. As the young woman helped her mother in the kitchen, she felt the weight of the gaze behind her. What normally passed with a few words had dragged on that morning. "Where did you go after church yesterday?" her mother asked, continuing to knead the dough. The question was simple, but it wasn't the right time. The young woman paused. "I stopped by the neighbor's house." Her mother didn't look up. "Which one?" There was a moment of silence. That emptiness was louder than the answer. "The one down the street." The dough was kneaded a little harder. Clearly the conversation wasn't over. The young man had woken up to a similar morning at home. His father was sitting at the table, stirring his tea, but his eyes never left his son. "I saw you go out last night." His voice wasn't harsh, but it was measured. There was a job, a night job. There was no answer, because there was no right answer. And at that moment, they both understood. The questions had begun. The shadows are approaching. As the day progressed, the feeling of being watched intensified. The young man saw 2 people stop talking and look at him as he passed through the market. When he turned a corner, he noticed the same men a little further on. Could it be a coincidence? Perhaps. But after encountering them for the third time, it no longer seemed like a coincidence. He slowed down. He stopped in front of a stall and examined the rope. They stopped too. He entered another street. They did too. His heart quickened, but he didn't show it, because to run away meant to appear guilty. The young woman, however, was not comfortable even inside the house. The maid standing at the door waited longer than usual. Looking out the window, she saw someone in the house opposite, through the gap in the curtain, without moving. Perhaps he wasn't looking, but he seemed to be looking. In the late afternoon, as the church bells rang, two women from the neighborhood passed by and stopped talking. She caught one word, night. And that's when she realized that gossip wasn't just words. It was taking shape. It was appearing on faces. It was spreading. A dangerous decision. They weren't supposed to meet that night, but if they didn't, perhaps there wouldn't be another opportunity. No signal came. Minutes passed, then much later than it should have, a candle lit up, weak, hesitant, as if someone was ready to extinguish it immediately. The young man didn't move. Could this be a trap? The young woman also stood at the window. Normally the curtain opened twice. This time it only opened once. This was also risky. But waiting was even more dangerous, because the unknown was the most frightening thing. The young man went out into the street. The young woman opened the door. Every step was calculated. Every corner was being listened to. Their hearts beat at the same pace. But they didn't know that tonight they weren't just waiting for each other, that others were waiting for them too. Tension gathering over the city. The city was no longer just a place of stones and streets. The city was made up of unspoken sentences, unfinished questions, shadows that lingered a little too long behind a window. When the young man left early in the morning, he noticed that the sounds that normally filled his path were absent. The blacksmith's hammer came down slower, the market vendors spoke less briefly, and people didn't smile at each other as casually as before. A group of men stood at the street corner. They seemed to be talking, but their eyes were scanning the passers-by. The young man didn't change his gait, because those who changed their gait attracted attention. He measured each step, stopped in front of a stall and looked at the fabrics, then continued on his way. The footsteps behind him, they were at the same speed. He turned a street. The sounds turned too. His heart quickened, but his face remained calm, because fear was the most expensive luxury in the Middle Ages. The young woman was also moving with similar tension at home. His mother kept him in the kitchen longer, sending a sibling to follow him when he had to go out. When he looked out the window, the curtain of the house opposite was slightly parted. Once, twice. Then it closed. When the church bells rang in the evening, the conversations in the neighborhood suddenly stopped. People turned their heads looking in the same direction, as if something unseen was approaching. And night was no longer a time for meetings, but for reckoning. No sign came. Then, too late, a candle was lit. But this time the light wasn't steady. It flickered, not in the wind. Behind an unsteady hand, the young man didn't move for minutes. Then he slowly withdrew, because the feeling inside told him this was more than an ordinary night. The young woman also looked out the window. That light was higher than it should have been. the wrong window, the wrong angle, the wrong night. His heart pounded in his chest. Something was broken. The order, the signs, the silent agreements. And the city was no longer just watching, it was preparing. Nobody knew what the next step would be, but everyone felt this. Everything that was hidden would soon come to light. Tension inside the houses that evening. The silence inside the houses was heavier than the whispers in the streets. The candles had been lit earlier than usual, but their light wasn't comforting. On the contrary, it cast shimmering shadows on the walls, amplifying every movement and imbuing people's faces with excessive meaning. When the young woman sat down at the table, she immediately noticed her mother's gaze. It carried more expectation than question, as if she didn't want to talk but couldn't rest easy if she didn't, while her father stared at the soup in his bowl, slowly dipping his spoon in, then lifting it, but hardly drinking any. For a while, only the sound of clinking dishes could be heard. Then, the awaited sentence came. "You've been going out a lot lately." The voice was calm, but calmness was the quietest form of danger. The young woman answered without raising her head. "Housework. Housework has always been there." That brief pause changed the atmosphere of the entire room. For a moment, the young woman thought she could hear everyone's heartbeats. Footsteps passing by the door were louder than any voice. Her father looked up. In the evenings, just one word, but it was filled with questions. The young woman swallowed. Things that don't get done during the day. Her mother tilted her head slightly to the side. Her gaze lingered on her daughter's face for a long time. Then she said nothing, but that silence was heavier than any answer. The narrowing circle in the streets. The next day, the city seemed smaller. The streets were the same. The houses were still there. But the people walking had changed. As the young man walked through the market, he noticed people stopping their conversations to look at him, then turning their heads away, but continuing to watch him out of the corner of their eyes. When he stopped in front of a shop, he saw the vendor trying to keep busy with his hands, but keeping his ears turned towards the street. Turning a corner, he noticed the same faces again a little further on. Could it be a coincidence? It could be, but after encountering them for the third time, it no longer seemed like a coincidence. He slowed his steps. They slowed theirs too. He stopped in front of a stall. They did too. His heart quickened, but his face remained calm, because panic leaves a mark. He turned into another street. Footsteps followed him. A group of children ran past. There was a brief commotion. The young man blended into the crowd, but he still felt it. The emptiness behind him, it wasn't really empty. It just wasn't visible, and this feeling haunted him all day. Wrong sign. That night could have been the night everything changed. The sign wasn't supposed to come, but it did, at the wrong time, in the wrong place, in the wrong way. The window creaked open, but longer than it should have. The candle lit up, but it went out and lit up again, as if someone couldn't decide. The young woman froze behind the curtain. Her heart pounded in her chest. That light didn't resemble the sign they were used to. It lasted too long. It was too visible, and a shadow stirred across the street. The young man noticed the same thing as he waited in the darkness. That light was brighter than on other nights, and it was very clear someone was standing in a corner, not walking, not speaking, just waiting. The young man recoiled, but he didn't run away, because running away was also a sign. The minutes stretched on. The light was still on. The shadow was still there. And the city seemed to hold its breath. At that moment, they both felt the same thing. This was no longer just a secret love. This was the creaking of a door about to open. And no one knew what was behind that door. The explosion of gossip. The city seemed restless, even under the morning sun. Doors opened, shops closed, people pretended to go to work, but no movement was as relaxed as before. The women gathered around the neighborhood fountain no longer whispered. They raised their voices slightly, but still without mentioning names. It's too obvious now. The lights at night, the side street, after the church. The sentences were fragmented, but when the fragments came together, a single picture emerged. The young man heard this in the market. Behind a fish stall, two men were talking, looking at him and falling silent. Women waiting in line in front of a bakery stopped mid-sentence as they passed him. The young woman felt the same things at home. Neighbors stared longer, maids asked questions twice. The doorman locked the door a little earlier in the evenings. It was as if everyone was trying to solve the same mystery. And that mystery, it no longer belonged to just two people. First open confrontation. Dinner had been set earlier than usual, and the bread on the table had long since lost its warmth. But no one noticed because everyone in the room was distracted. The moment the young woman sat down, she felt her father's gaze lock onto her. The sound of the spoon touching the soup was louder than necessary. Her mother listened without lifting her eyes from her bowl, that seemed to weigh every word. Her father didn't speak for a while, only stirring his spoon, then slowly placing it on the table, the small metallic sound filling the room. Lately, he said, drawing out the sentence as if he didn't want to continue but couldn't bear not saying it. You're not in your room at night. The young woman felt her breath quicken, but she kept her face calm, because even the slightest tremor would amplify suspicion. Sometimes I can't sleep, she said, weighing her words. Her father narrowed his eyes. And you go to the window. Her mother tilted her head slightly but didn't intervene. The room felt constricted. The candle flame flickered. The young woman felt her throat dry. To get some fresh air, she said. Her father put the spoon down again, this time slightly. You don't look for fresh air at midnight, he added more sharply. The young woman didn't answer, for any word she said would only breed another question, and the silence made it clear that everyone at the table was thinking the same thing. Pursuit and trap. The next day, as the young man stepped out onto the street, he felt the change in the atmosphere from his very first step. People fell silent while talking, avoided eye contact, but after he passed, they stared back. The fact that two men appeared several times on the way to the market might have started as a coincidence, but when he saw the same faces at the third corner, it was impossible not to understand that it was intentional. He consciously slowed his steps, stopped in front of a stall, pretended to examine belt buckles. The men stopped too. A child ran past. The crowd briefly mingled. The young man changed direction at this opportunity, but after a few steps he noticed them again. They maintained their distance, but did not take their eyes off him. His heart was racing. He regulated his breathing to hide it, because panic would only give him away. He turned into another street. They turned too. He stopped in front of a door and crouched down as if tying his shoelaces. When he glanced around, he saw that the men had also slowed down. And at that moment he understood that this was no longer just being followed. Someone was leading him somewhere, waiting for him to make a mistake. Perhaps an escape, perhaps a sudden turn, perhaps darkness. Entering a door because every wrong move would be enough to solidify the rumors. Final warning, that night the window wasn't opened. The candle wasn't lit. No sign was given, but the city still didn't fall silent. The sound of a small stone hitting the door was enough to make the young woman's heart race. She froze for a moment, then slowly approached the window, parting the curtain only with her fingertips. The street seemed empty, but this emptiness wasn't safe, for the feeling that someone had been standing there moments before still lingered. There were no footprints on the stones, no lantern light, but there seemed to be a gaze hanging in the air, as if the darkness hadn't completely receded, a pair of eyes lurking behind the corners. At the same time, the young man had heard a similar sound on his own street, noticing a silhouette quickly turning the corner, its identity unclear, but the hurried steps evident. The edge of its cloak had touched the stone wall for a moment, then vanished. The message was clear. Someone wanted to show that they were watching them. Someone was declaring that they were no longer hiding, only silent. The city had stopped gossiping. Now it was issuing a direct warning because this small stone was more powerful than the unlit candle, the closed window, the silenced whispers. It reminded him that everything he had ignored grew heavier at night. That short sound echoing in the darkness was like the culmination of weeks of accumulated doubts, because no one knew what the next step would be. A warning, a confrontation, or doors being knocked on, names being shouted aloud, everything hidden spilling out into the streets. The unknown was growing, spreading, multiplying in the narrow streets, creeping under windows, settling on doorsteps, becoming a heavy weight on hearts. And in the streets of the Middle Ages, the unknown was truly the most dangerous thing. The day the wait ended, morning had settled over the city like a heavy fog, filling not only the cobblestone streets, but also people's thoughts. Doors opened slowly, shutters were half raised, and everyone looked to both ends of the street before stepping out, because what had happened during the night was no longer just shrouded in darkness, but had seeped into the day. The young woman woke up early but couldn't get out of bed. She stood by the window and watched the silence of the street. Normally, at this hour of the morning, one would hear children's voices, vendors shouting, and horse-drawn carts passing by. But now there was only the wind, a faint hum filtering through the rooftops, and the creaking of doors slowly closing. It was as if everyone had decided at the same time to retreat into their homes, trying to remain out of sight. When his mother called him into the kitchen, her voice was more measured than usual. She wasn't asking questions, but her gaze spoke volumes. The young woman noticed her hands trembling as she cut the bread, and to hide it, she pressed the knife a little harder, because now even the smallest movement seemed to be watched. The slightest delay, the smallest fleeting glance, planting new possibilities in someone's mind. The young man felt the same pressure when he left his house. Everyone he met on the street looked at him briefly, then turned away, but those brief moments spoke louder than weeks of silence. The blacksmith's anvil clanged less today, the vendors in the market arranged their goods more slowly, people chose their words carefully when they spoke, because the city was no longer just listening to a story, it was placing itself within that story. When the church bells rang at noon, the sound lasted longer than usual, and it sounded more like a warning than an ordinary call. People stopped and listened, looked at each other. No one spoke loudly, but everyone thought the same thing. Something had changed. And it wasn't just the gossip that had changed. The rules seemed to be bending. The boundaries were blurring. Glances were becoming bolder. Questions were being asked more closely, even if not explicitly. For a moment, the young woman felt the whole city hold its breath, as if the next wrong step would cause everyone's gaze to turn to a single point. The young man felt it too. Now they needed to be careful not to hide, but to stand tall, because what is hidden is strong as long as it remains hidden. But when it begins to be seen, it is fragile. And the city, it was no longer just watching. It was approaching a decision. Hiding is no longer enough. In the afternoon, the city seemed to come alive a little. But this liveliness was fueled not by old habits, but by unease. Shops opened, goods were displayed on the stalls, but the voices of the sellers were low. Even while shopping, customers looked around, weighing their words as they spoke. When the young woman left the house, she felt her mother's gaze follow her to the door. This time, she hadn't been given a sibling to follow, but this didn't mean she was free. On the contrary, it indicated that a period had begun where everyone was watching more closely. As she walked down the street, two neighbors approaching from the opposite direction stopped for a moment, then gave way, but their gazes didn't leave her. As she approached the market, she heard the whispers grow louder, sentences left unfinished, as if everyone was hearing the same story from different mouths. And with each step closer to the center of the story, it became a little more visible. The young man was under similar pressure, the shopkeeper averting his gaze as he entered, another scrutinizing him as he left, a child watching him run away. Small signs, but cumulatively heavy. Hiding was no longer enough, because hiding meant assuming he was unnoticed. And the city now noticed everything. The expressions on people's faces had changed. Curiosity, suspicion, and anticipation were all visible simultaneously. For the first time, the young man thought that perhaps the next encounter would be met not with a secret glance, but with an open question. The new form of gossip. Gossip was no longer just whispers. Sentences were formed more clearly at the fountain, behind market stalls, on church steps. Directions were indicated even if names weren't mentioned. Times were described. People told the same things over and over, each repetition sharpening the story a little more. When the young woman left the church, she quickened her steps to avoid hearing what was being said behind her back, but the words followed her like the wind. Fragments like last night, the window, the side street, the light, hanging in the air without leaving any gaps between them. As the young man returned from the market, he noticed two women pointing at him. Then, falling silent and approaching each other, he saw a man nodding his head as he listened. And these small movements were far more dangerous than the vague glances of weeks ago, because now people weren't just watching. They were confirming each other's statements. As evening approached, The city seemed to speak with one voice, but no one spoke aloud, which amplified the weight of each word. When the young woman returned home, she saw the expression on her mother's face. No questions had been asked, but answers were expected. As the young man entered his street, he noticed a neighbor standing in the doorway, staring at him for a long time, a silent announcement of an impending confrontation. The night's decision. When night fell, the streets emptied earlier than usual. Lanterns were lit, but their light didn't spread. It was as if the darkness wasn't deliberately receding, but rather intensifying. The young woman stood in front of her window but didn't part the curtain. Not knowing if someone was standing outside was more frightening than looking and seeing. The young man didn't wait at the corner, didn't stand by the wall, because all the old habits had become dangerous. Yet both looked up at the sky at the same time. The moon was like a thin line, and this thin line spoke of the night's instability. For a while nothing happened. Then a door closed in a distant street, very harshly. Both flinched. Then footsteps. Stopped. Continued. Then disappeared. This wasn't a night of meeting. This was a night of waiting. And waiting, perhaps the harshest punishment. Because while waiting, one considers every possibility. As morning approached, the fog slowly lifted from the streets, but it didn't dissipate from people's faces. Shops opened, doors creaked open. Everyone seemed to be trying to go about their daily business, but at every step they paused and looked around, because now the only thing awaited was not just the actions of the two young people, but how the whole city would react. When the church bells rang, the prolonged sound didn't seem like a coincidence to anyone. People stopped and listened, looked at each other, then continued on their way. But everyone was thinking at the same time. Someone would speak today, someone would ask a question today, someone would knock on the door today. And as the young woman looked down from her window, she noticed that the neighbors had begun to gather earlier than usual, standing long in front of their doors, communicating without speaking, as if words were floating in the air before they were even formed. Even though no one dared to say it aloud, the whole street was weighing the same possibility. When the young man went out into the street, he saw the two shopkeepers looking after him, their heads close together, and these small movements were a sign of attention that could no longer be concealed, because this city was not only watching, but slowly preparing to pass judgment. The man who arrived at the young woman's house around noon was no ordinary visitor, for in this city everyone who came to the door was followed by other doors, other ears, other eyes, and her mother couldn't hide the tension on her face when she let him in. As soon as the man sat down, he looked around, waited before speaking, as if calculating where his words would echo in the room, then began, "Lately," he paused, took a breath. "We've been seeing lights in front of some houses at night," he said, without naming names or pointing, but everyone understood what he meant. The young woman stood in the corner of the kitchen, not joining the conversation but absorbing every word. Her father sat a little harder in his chair. Her mother clasped her hands in front of her. As the man continued, the softness in his voice diminished. Sentences began like questions but ended like warnings. "There will be misunderstandings," he said. "People will talk," he added, and that last sentence became the heaviest word in the whole room, because even though no one said it aloud, everyone knew where these conversations might lead. When night fell, the city was almost completely silent. Lanterns were lit, but the lights were confined to the narrow streets. The wind entered through the doorways, gently rustling the wooden shutters. The young woman sat in her room, not approaching the window, not parting the curtain, because looking was sometimes more dangerous than seeing, and seeing now meant something irreversible. The young man did not leave the front of his house, but stood behind the door, listening to the sounds outside, trying to distinguish each rustle, each rubbing of a stone, each distant footstep. The moon was hidden behind the clouds, and this concealment seemed like a symbol of an impending confrontation. Although the sky was clear, there was no light, as if the city had consciously chosen to remain in darkness. A dog barked somewhere, then fell silent. The cessation of barking was even more frightening because a barking animal falling silent could be a sign of someone approaching. The wind swept dry leaves down the street and struck them against the stone walls. The sound was enough to startle the young woman. She held her breath for a moment, then slowly exhaled again, for she was afraid that even her own heartbeat could be heard. At the same time, the young man moved a little closer to the door, not touching the wooden surface, but holding his hand in the air, as if someone were about to knock. Hours seemed to pass, but time stood still. The lamp flickered, shadows lengthened on the walls, then shortened, then changed shape again, each change summoning a new possibility. A neighbor's door opened, then immediately closed. A metallic sound came from the church bell tower, carried by the wind. But the bell did not ring, only a short, meaningless sound, like chains clattering together, was heard. And this half sound created more tension than a full bell strike. The young woman decided not to go to the window anymore, but this decision didn't comfort her, because not looking out the window didn't mean nothing was happening outside. The young man had sworn not to go out into the street, but the silence of the street seemed to be calling him to the door. Both of them thought at the same time, perhaps no one would come tonight, perhaps no one would knock on the doors, perhaps in the morning everything would look the same as before. But this possibility seemed less real than the others, because the city was silent, and sometimes a city's silence was more dangerous than its screams. As the morning sun struck the stone walls, the city seemed to have shaken off the weight of the previous night, but the young woman's heart still beat silently by the window. She looked out into the street. There was no one there, but the emptiness, instead of reassuring her, left her with a subtle expectation, as if something was about to happen. Yet, with the daylight, longing, not fear, prevailed, for the desire to see him had become a stronger feeling than hiding, and instead of blaming herself for it, she wondered how she would navigate this feeling. At the same time, as the young man opened his shop door, he realized that, in the silence of the night, the only thing he was thinking about wasn't the danger, but how their next encounter would be, when a glance would turn into courage, when a greeting would become more than words, how people in this city concealed their love. He tried to suppress the pounding of his own heart as he pondered these thoughts, because everything was moving slowly, but this slowness only deepened the feeling growing within them. When they met in the market around noon, people passing by were talking, shopping. Life was flowing as if it were normal, but their world had taken on a completely different rhythm in just 2 steps. the young woman's fingers lingering for a moment at the bread stall, the young man looking up beside his fish basket to make eye contact. It was enough to erase all the tension of the night, and both immediately turned their eyes away, hoping this brief encounter had gone unnoticed. They couldn't speak, they couldn't approach each other, but small gestures spoke volumes. A small scratch on the edge of his hand, the way he tucked his hair behind his ear, the slight tilt of his head, all were like secret sentences, a silent conversation in the midst of a crowd, and this silent conversation continued to echo within them, even after they parted. Both continued on their way, thinking about how short that moment had been, but how long its impact would last. Hope left to the night. As evening fell, the city slowed down again. Shop shutters came down, street lights were switched on, and the smell of food rose from inside the houses. But the young woman's mind was not on the plate on the table, but on the street beyond the window. The young man, too, took a slightly longer route home, choosing corners where he could be alone, because even if he couldn't voice his thoughts aloud, he felt he could be a little braver in the darkness of the night. And this courage was fueled not by fear, but by longing. This time no stones would be thrown, no candles would be extinguished. There would only be a shadow, a stance, a waiting, perhaps. But even waiting felt like a promise now, because at the end of each night they fell asleep with the same question. Would they see each other again tomorrow? What would be the cost of loving in this city? But the heart continued to beat without giving clear answers to any of these questions. Courage from the heart. When night had completely fallen, the streets had quieted down, but this quietness was not threatening, but soft and heavy. When the young woman parted the curtain, her heart quickened, not with fear, but with hope. She thought she saw him on the opposite sidewalk. Perhaps he really was there. Perhaps it was just wishful thinking playing tricks on her eyes, but she didn't realize it at that moment, because what mattered was not danger, but possibility. When the young man looked at the window from within the shadows, he knew that there could be costs to loving in this city, but he also realized that he couldn't give up, because some emotions far outpace logic, and he felt that they could form a bond even without approaching each other, without speaking, just by sharing the same night. He understood that this bond was no longer fueled by fear, but by a resolute longing. Both of them sensed that the moment was short but transformative, because they were now at an irreversible threshold. That day the city seemed quieter than usual, but this calm wasn't enough to quell the storm raging within them. When the young woman left the house, her mother's gaze lingered a little longer, pausing to catch her breath on the doorstep before disappearing into the street without revealing anything. The young man had left early to open his shop, but as his hands rested on the counter, his mind kept wandering to the same street corner. Perhaps today, he thought, perhaps today we can see each other a little closer. We had already learned that we could communicate without words, but now the language of the heart demanded more. As they began walking in the same direction through the crowd, there were 3 steps between them, then 2, then 3 again. They deliberately maintained their distance so no one would notice, but with each step they grew closer. The rhythm of their footsteps on the stone pavement seemed to have found its rhythm. When they saw their silhouettes side by side reflected in a shop window, they both turned their heads away at the same time, because that brief glimpse was like the momentary release of emotions that had been hidden for months. The young woman felt her heart race. She consciously slowed her steps, pretending to listen to the conversations of those around her, but her ears were focused only on the footsteps behind her. At the same time, the young man stopped his hand as he passed a basket, pressing his fingers against the wood and regulating his breathing. For they knew that every time they wanted to get closer, they had to stop. In this city, love sometimes meant waiting more than walking, sometimes being on the same street and not being able to touch, sometimes only finding courage in the direction of a shadow. And today, both of them wished that those shadows would remain side by side a little longer. When they reached the market square, the crowd had grown even larger. The voices of street vendors echoed beneath the stone arches. Rolls of cloth were unwrapped, and copper plates gleamed in the sun. But their attention, amidst all this activity, was fixed solely on where each other stood. The young woman stopped in front of a vegetable stall and pretended to touch the basket. The young man a few steps away simultaneously bent down as if asking about prices. This silent arrangement between them seemed as if it had been rehearsed countless times beforehand. One stopped where the other stopped. One walked slowly, thus maintaining the same distance and staying in the same line. Each small change in direction quickened their hearts, and even feeling one's shoulder approaching the other left a strange warmth within them. The young woman, lowering her head to examine the apples on the counter, noticed the young man looking at her in the reflection of the glass. She immediately turned her gaze away, but couldn't hide the smile at the corner of her lips. At the same time, the young man fiddled with a coin, as if to avoid eye contact, but they couldn't help but feel each other's presence. The people passing between them, the baskets they carried, the spilled grain, the rising voices. It was all like a curtain, behind which a silent closeness, known only to the two of them, was unfolding. And with each step they felt they could become a little bolder. As the streets gradually quieted in the afternoon, the sun began to cast long lines on the walls. The awnings in front of the shops were being gathered up, and people were hurrying home. But the young woman deliberately took a longer route, passing a small fountain, turning into a narrow passageway. The young man followed a few steps behind, making the same turn, for this time the protective veil separating them had given way to silence, a silence both dangerous and hopeful. As they rounded a corner, the distance between them had truly shortened for the first time, not 3 steps, not 2, but almost a breath. The young man feared his heartbeat would be heard, and the young woman slowed her steps, for if she quickened, the distance between them would disappear completely. They didn't speak, but the sound of their footsteps echoing on the stone pavement mingled, their shoulders almost touching. In that moment, there was both fear and happiness, for it felt as if the city was watching them, but at the same time, the fact that they were so close for the first time warmed their hearts. This closeness was perhaps the boldest step taken after months of silence. As evening approached, the streets began to fill with people again. The smell of warm bread wafted from the bakeries, and steam rose from the windows as soup steamed. But for the young woman and the young man, time was racing towards the moment they had to move away from each other, because as the crowd dispersed, they had to become invisible, and remaining invisible meant separation. The young woman stopped at the crossroads, clutched her basket tighter, slowed her steps, and looked down as if she had dropped something, trying to buy a few more seconds. The young man simultaneously pretended to look away, but his shoulders tensed, for he knew that if he stopped, he would attract attention, and if he continued, this moment would be over. Neither spoke, but that brief pause held unspoken sentences. Would they walk again tomorrow at the same time on the same street, maintaining the same distance? Or would courage one day prevail and break all the rules? The young woman bowed her head slightly. This small gesture was not a farewell, but a promise of a postponed meeting. When the young man saw this, he felt a warmth in his heart, because in this city, love was sometimes born not from a wave, but from an unnoticed nod, sometimes from a brief glance before disappearing into the crowd. As the young woman walked away, she quickened her steps, but stopped a few streets later to catch her breath, her heart still beating as if at that crossroads. The young man, too, turned in the opposite direction and stopped at the corner, placing his hand on the stone wall. It was as if the emotions he had held back all day were now unleashed, because these encounters were no longer merely coincidences, but were slowly transforming into planned moments, and each parting carried a silent promise that the next meeting would be bolder. Love that wins silently, the accumulation of small moments, the hidden glances, the unfinished steps, the hands that couldn't touch while walking side by side in the crowd, the windows left open at night, the unlit candles, and the hopeful waiting left on silent streets. These were no longer just small details of the past, but links in a chain that slowly changed their lives. Because every clandestine encounter, every conscious turn, every brief pause at a crossroads deepened the feeling growing in their hearts, replacing fear with determination and uncertainty with patient waiting. Even though the city seemed to be watching them, this feeling was no longer as frightening, because an invisible strength had formed from sharing the same risk together. People still talked, gossip was whispered, the medieval streets remained as narrow and filled with curious glances as ever, but they had learned to get lost in those glances, creating their own silent language. A nod, a slowed step, a slightly longer pause in a corner were no longer mere coincidences, but consciously chosen signs, and all these small moments had ultimately shaped the love they felt for each other. The anxiety that had initially gripped their hearts had given way to a heavy but determined courage. For every secret encounter, every brief moment spent in a crowd, had taught them something. In this city, love sometimes grew not through shouting, but through patience. Sometimes it strengthened not in public squares, but in narrow alleys, and that was exactly what they had experienced. The bond they had formed without touching, without speaking, simply by sharing the same paths, had gradually transformed into an intimacy that needed no words. The young woman no longer feared her mother's gaze as she left the house in the morning, and the young man noticed that his hands didn't tremble as he opened his shop, because the feeling within them carried more hope than fear, and hope was the hardest thing to hide. Once it began to grow, it seeped into a person's walk, their gaze, their breath. They knew this, but they were tired of hiding it, because love, no matter how long it is hidden, eventually finds a way. The stone walls, the dimly lit streets, the silent squares that once seemed threatening had now become part of their story. They had waited at the same corners, passed by the same bakeries, stood by the same fountains. And the city, despite all its gossip, had witnessed this patient rapprochement, for in the Middle Ages, love was not only experienced between two people, but also took shape amidst the shadows of an entire settlement. Every doorway, every window curtain, every street corner seemed to bear the silent traces of this long wait. The stones that recognized their footsteps now seemed to guide them instead of frightening them. People had noticed. Perhaps they hadn't spoken aloud, but the stares had lengthened. The questions had multiplied, the whispers had grown heavier. The eyes lingered a little longer in the marketplace. The sentences left unfinished at the fountain. The conversations abruptly interrupted in front of the shops. Each seemed to surround them like an invisible web. Yet, despite all this, the two young people had learned to walk taller instead of retreating in fear, because the feelings they had kept hidden for months were no longer so fragile as to vanish overnight. Each silent meeting had strengthened them a little more, deepening their bond with each other. The slightly more relaxed posture of their shoulders as they passed through the crowd, the determination rather than hesitation in their steps, were small but powerful outward signs of this inner transformation. There was no turning back now, because once the heart had made a decision, it found its way no matter how narrow the city. The narrow streets seemed there not to separate them, but to bring them together again. The squares were not as daunting as before. The nights lengthened, not only for hiding, but for carrying hope. And this silent transformation was turning their story from a mere secret rapprochement into a slow but unstoppable bond. A bond that even whispers could no longer weaken, but rather made more visible, growing patiently but resolutely, like a light seeping through the stones of the city. Love that silently wins. Finally, all the waiting, the unfinished steps, and the secret glances had ended not with a big explosion, but with a calm acceptance, because their story had been won slowly, not with shouts. Their closeness hadn't happened overnight, but had been woven with months of patience, and that's precisely why it was so strong. Now they no longer hesitated to walk in the same direction in the marketplace. They didn't hide their gazes when they stopped at crossroads. The small signs had grown, giving way to a silent but open stance. They didn't have to consciously adjust their steps as they passed through the crowd. They could smile slightly instead of turning their heads when their eyes met. They could stand side by side without needing to hide their shoulders. And these small changes were a sign of a deep trust that had replaced months of shyness. This story showed that in the Middle Ages, love wasn't always about knights and grand pronouncements. Sometimes it blossomed among ordinary people, on stone streets, amidst the smells of bakeries, behind curtains parted at night. A brief glance shared in front of a bakery, a few breaths spent side by a fountain, shoulders almost touching in a narrow street. These weren't perhaps epic events, but they were the very moments that slowly transformed the heart. This journey, which began with fear, grew stronger with patience, eventually transforming into an unseen but unwavering bond. Now nights were no longer just for hiding, but for building hope for tomorrow, and mornings began with the silent happiness they carried within. Their story wasn't a love that faded into the crowds, but a commitment that, over time, everyone noticed but no one spoke aloud, because the city had seen everything. The stone walls had listened to whispers, windows had opened, curtains had closed. Roads had separated and reunited them countless times, And in the end, it had left behind an example of how powerful the slow approach of two people can be. Perhaps the strongest loves are the quietest ones, those that don't rush, those that know how to wait, those that begin with fear and continue with hope. And theirs was exactly such a love, growing unseen but with deep roots, unshakable, defying time. And now, rest your eyes for a moment. The echoes of this silent love that blossomed in the narrow streets of the Middle Ages still seem to linger among the stone walls, the scent of warm bread rising from the bakeries, the gentle sound of the fountains, the hopeful waiting behind the curtains that part at night, all slowly fade, giving way to a peaceful silence, because this story was won not with grand words, but with small steps, a love that grew patiently, a bond that began with fear and continued with trust, mingling in the city's memories. Perhaps now you too can imagine walking among these stone streets, your footsteps echoing softly, the light of the lamps casting flickering shadows on the walls, the wind blowing gently, and the story of this love that quietly blossomed within this old city slowly surrenders you to the silence of the night, without weighing down your heart, without tiring your mind, only filling you with peace, because some stories don't end with a loud cry, some close with a whisper, and those are the most enduring.